In this lecture, we take a look at key characteristics of social and behavioral theories. What is a theory? A theory is an explicit, logical system of ideas. It's not just one idea or one hypothesis. It's a set of ideas that are linked together in a coherent manner. Examples are Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity, and this semester we'll study Freud's psychodynamic theories and Albert Bandura's social learning theory, among many others. Each theory has certain components. It contains key constructs. These are the main ideas, or you could think of them as variables in a theory. A theory has propositions or proposals about the nature of the phenomenon of interest. And theories have hypotheses about relationships among their key constructs. A good theory helps us understand phenomenon. It helps us organize observations, information, and ideas. It explains and/or predicts the phenomenon of interest. So it may deal with causation, that is cause and effect, or prevention or intervention. A good theory is testable. It's verifiable and falsifiable, so it can be tested with logic and empirical data. A good theory is also parsimonious. That means that it's as simple and clear as it can be without oversimplifying. This means that if we have two theories that are equally good at explaining some phenomenon, but one has more information, it's more convoluted, it's more complex, we would prefer the simpler theory because it gets the job done without additional and apparently unnecessary information. Theories have certain limitations. They are fallible. They may contain untested assumptions, and they may be incorrect, like the flat earth theory was incorrect. The theory that the sun revolved around the earth, also incorrect. But theories are always tentative. They're open to revision, perhaps improvement. We cannot prove a theory or hypothesis. Another set of limitations has to do with the fact that many theories are narrow or incomplete. They focus on selected phenomena and, for the most part, are not holistic. Theories may ignore alternative, plausible explanations for the phenomena they care about. Some theories are deterministic or reductionistic. These are simplifications. So certainly in terms of human development and social relations, theories are rarely universal. They rarely apply to all people at all points in time in all cultures. This is because these theories are socially constructed. They're created by individuals who exist at a certain point in time and place in a culture, and they're influenced by the ideology, values, and worldviews of their creators. How do we use theories in social work? Theories can guide our assessments. They help us understand the nature of human and social problems, and they can guide action, that is, prevention and intervention. We find that multiple theoretical perspectives are often needed to attain a holistic view of human and social conditions. In critically appraising theories in social work, Robbins and colleagues said that theories should be consistent with social work ethics and values. Theories should be verifiable and evaluated with rigorous research, and they should do no harm. Now, we find that some mainstream theories in psychology, sociology, and social work do not meet these criteria. For example, some of the theories that we'll study this semester have ideas that are explicitly sexist, racist, and homophobic. This is not consistent with social work ethics and values, and it can be argued that these theories are harmful to those subgroups. Let's take a look at the relationship between theory, practice, and research. Social work practice is conducted at a variety of levels, from micro-level work with individuals, families, and groups, to meso-level practice, including agency administration, program development, to macro-level practice, which involves policy development and policy analysis at the government or global levels. We also have research on social work practice. This research can inform practice, and it also can evaluate and help us understand the effects of various types of practice. And theory, which is the topic of this course, are the ideas that can inform practice and can be tested by social research. So these realms, theory, practice, and research, are all somewhat independent, but they relate to each other. And we like to say that we want to focus on the sweet spot, the area in which that is informed by both social work practice, empirical research, and good social and behavioral theory. There are diverse ways of knowing about the world. How do we learn about the world? Where do our ideas come from? Well, many of our ideas come from tradition and authority. So our traditions are the stories that we're told, the rituals that we have, and the authorities include our parents, our teachers, government officials, religious leaders, and so on. So these traditions and authorities are some of the most important influences on what we think we know. We also can learn about the world through intuition. So some of what we know does not come from the past or from other people. It comes from our own sense of how things are or should be. So intuition is really sort of an internal sense. This might be related to everyday experience. We do learn about the world through our own firsthand experience. And here I'm thinking of this as a sort of unsystematic approach to observation, our sort of casual observation, ordinary experience. A very important source of knowledge for us. And I mention these sources of knowledge in order to contrast them with scientific methods. And science, of course, involves systematic observation and the use of logic and data. There are different scientific methods. They may use inductive and/or deductive reasoning. And we have a variety of scientific methods, including qualitative and quantitative methods and mixed methods for learning about the world. So all of these are sources of knowledge. This is not to suggest that one is better than the other, but to point out that we learn about the world in many ways. Your readings also talk about paradigms. A paradigm is a worldview. It's broader than any single theory. This term is overused and often misused in social work literature. There's probably too much discussion of paradigms in the social work literature, and a lot of discussion of paradigm changes. And this makes it seem that paradigm changes are happening all the time, when in fact they're not. If a paradigm is a worldview, a big, broad view, that's hard to change. The article by Shriver talked about traditional or dominant paradigms versus alternative paradigms. And Shriver's point here is that at any given point in time, there is a main worldview that's dominant or traditional, and it might be challenged by an alternative view. He talked about 3 different eras. In the pre-modern era, that is before modern science, the traditional or dominant paradigm was the church and state. So the church and state told us what was true, and we were to follow those authorities. That was challenged by modern science. And modern science said that knowledge and truth don't come from authorities, they can come from experiments and surveys and systematic observation. So we entered the modern era, an era in which scientific methods were in ascendancy. And that has been challenged by another alternative paradigm called the postmodern view. The postmodern view holds that scientific methods are not necessarily the best way of learning about the world, but there's much that can be learned through our subjective experience, our intuition. So each of these paradigms was dominant at a particular point in time and place. I would argue that Shriver's characterizations of some of these paradigms are oversimplified and outdated. Shriver makes contrasts between sort of dichotomous views, and I would suggest he sets up a somewhat false set of dichotomies, arguing that the traditional paradigm now is the sort of an old scientific view, and the alternative paradigm is the postmodern view. In fact, the different paradigms that are used in social work practice now are more subtle and more complex. Now, one of the reasons we asked you to read the Shriver article was to have you contrast it with Williams' article. Williams also talks about paradigms, but she talks about 4 paradigms that are used in social work today. These are the post-positivist paradigm, which is focused on scientific methods, but not in the rigid sense that the early modern scientists viewed science. There's also constructivism, which is a more sort of organic look at how meaning is created among social groups of people. There's critical theory, which focuses on issues of politics and power, and postmodernism, which focuses on subjective and local knowledge. So take a good look at the chart in the Williams article on the top of page 216. Here she talks about these 4 paradigms, and the Williams article is applying these paradigms to problems of cultural competence, but they're actually applied to many, many other topics in social work. So when Williams talks about the different paradigms' views of the nature of culture, you can also think about this as different views on the nature of reality. So, for example, in post-positivism, the idea is that reality is relatively stable, it can be verified, and we should go about learning about reality through scientific methods. While in constructivism, the idea is that reality is created in local and specific relationships, and we have to learn about it by talking with people in their natural settings. Critical theory thinks that the nature of reality is that it's basically historically derived from social, political, and economic arrangements, and that power and privilege are key ideas here. And postmodernism views the nature of reality as unfixed, constantly evolving, changing, and best learned through subjective, local methods. So let me ask, which of these paradigms appeals most to you, and why? Think about that. Different people in our class will have different answers to that question, and there's no right answer to this question. Some paradigms appeal to certain people more than others, and that's fine. You may have one favorite or 2 favorites. Be aware of that. Be aware of the fact that those ideas shape your worldview. Now, you might also find that some paradigms are better suited to certain kinds of problems or questions than others. So you might use one paradigm more for certain kinds of problems and another for other kinds of problems. So I certainly do this. For example, if I'm thinking about whether, on average, 1 or 2 interventions is more effective, I'm going to look at questions of intervention effectiveness probably from a post-positivist view. That's just my own take on it. I would look at scientific methods for comparing effectiveness of 2 treatments, for example. If we're interested in how community residents cope with violence, well, that's more of a constructivist, critical theory or postmodern lens. I think those lenses would all be more useful, for example, than the post-positivist lens. In any case, Morgan argues that you can take a pragmatic approach to paradigms. We can use multiple methods and different paradigms even in the same inquiry. So we can use these different lenses to look at questions and problems that we have, and each will give us some different information. Let's talk a bit about cultural competence and diversity, the topic of the Williams article. I want to tell you that there's been an important evolution of education on culture and diversity in social work. It used to be that we taught cultural competence and diversity by having students learn about selected cultures. So the text that you would get in a course on cultural competence and diversity would have a series of chapters in it, each focused on a different culture or ethnicity. So typically, you'd have a chapter titled The African American Family. You'd have another chapter titled The Hispanic or Latino Family, another on the Asian families, another on European families. And this approach just basically reified stereotypes about certain groups. It focused a lot on commonalities within groups and very little on differences within groups. So one could argue that this was actually harmful to learning about culture and diversity, and fortunately we stopped doing that a while ago. But that approach was replaced with an emphasis on the students' lived experiences with difference. So instead of, quote, learning about different cultures, we would talk about our own experiences with racism and sexism and homophobia. And while that was very personal and to some extent useful, it was also quite idiosyncratic. Nowadays, our approach to learning about cultural competence and diversity really focuses on understanding different worldviews and, importantly, understanding the assumptions that we make and the limitations of our own worldview. We cannot learn about all cultures. There are too many cultures, and there's so much variation within any culture that we cannot learn all cultures. We can learn what culture is, what diversity means, and how it limits our own worldview. Here's some references, useful reading on these topics that are not shown elsewhere. Talk to you soon.